We live in an age of information. Not only the internet and social media pouring endless news, fake news, trivial stuff endlessly into our lives, but we also seem to have an access to information of the type that no one ever knew before. We get told about ancient secrets that are being revealed, new discoveries, new insights, all of which happens in the frame of what I would refer to as the more or less kind of new age belief system that dominates the non-religious thinking in the world today. And that's always full of fantastic claims and new best-selling books about ancient wisdom, funny enough. What I really want to talk about today is the fact that we neglect so much ancient wisdom, that we've got this huge weight of human history and human experience that in amongst all the drama and chaos and war and superstition and everything else, that all of which exists to this very day anyway, lies the seeds of wisdom that are passed from generation to generation to generation that teach us how to be a human being, how to understand the world that we find ourselves in, how to cope with the world that we find ourselves in. You know, there's a lot of belief in so-called New Age circles that we've evolved in our thinking and spirituality, that we're on the brink of some great Deus ex machina, as theorists of drama call it, which is when in a play, when there's just nothing you can do to write the hero out of an impossible situation, and so one of the gods descends, or something descends from the gods, and that saves the day. And despite our tendency not to believe in gods descending to earth anymore these days, it does strike me that a lot of the belief systems of today do seem to require that. And when does such a belief system arise? When we're desperate, when we just need rescuing because nothing on earth is working any longer. So, in a nutshell, and not too much of what I want to talk about today, is the fact that the world that we live in, to me, seems less spiritually evolved than much of what has happened before in human history, because it is so much about materialism and the individual and the glory of the individual, the denial of our non-physical nature, be it spirituality, be it death. So much of that has fallen away in our knowledge that we can mostly agree that people today find themselves often confused about goals, confused about purpose, confused about what is the meaning of this wild, crazy world that we live in, what is the point of it all, what am I supposed to believe, what am I supposed to do. As I've said, in my profession as an astrologer, it's very clear to me that we are in a worse state of knowledge than we were before in history, and I'm sure many people who deal with people and their problems and the stuff that faces us, from the most practical to the most spiritual, will also have experienced that we are in a state of greater confusion than we've ever been before, despite our increased knowledge. There's no doubt we understand so many things better than recent ancestors, but it doesn't seem to help us as human beings. So what I'd really like to talk about today is what from the past can help us as human beings. What is the wisdom of the ancestors that has been passed on, the great secrets of ancient people that have been passed on that we could still benefit from today, but which we seem to have forgotten so much of in our ego, that we're better and we know better, and that ancient people were primitive and superstitious and their sciences were crazy. And while some of that is factually true, that they might not have understood certain things scientifically that we understand, we throw out a lot of our humanity when we throw out tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years of human experience and human knowledge that has been passed from generation to generation. No amount of book knowledge or science or any of those kind of things can match up to a huge, vast body of human experience. Doesn't substitute for actual scientific knowledge or whatever you want to think of as knowledge as, but certainly would help us live as human beings. So, I mean, when you look at some of the stuff that is published today as ancient wisdom, the most classic example being that book and tape and every other money-making device you can think of called The Secret, which claimed to be, basically the secret knowledge that has been shared by all ancient people, that all ancient people knew. And apart from the ridiculous nonsense that the contents of that book constituted, what offended me the most about that book was that claim is precisely the opposite of the truth. Any of our ancestors reading that book would have been completely horrified that it is literally 180 degrees different than what ancient wisdom generally encourages about how to live as a human being. So look, there's a lot of ancient wisdom out there. There's a lot of different cultures that we've inherited this knowledge from, and I certainly couldn't talk about everything like that. But what I would like to talk about, focusing really just on two cultures that I'm more familiar with, what of ancient wisdom that we probably find in all cultures or most cultures from the past can we still learn today? What essence can we distill from some of it that gets us going and is at least relevant today? And I think when we do that, we find some core truths about human beings and about being one that are as valid today as they've ever been. And not only that, help remind us how to deal with this difficult world and how to be a better person and how to deal with so many of the things that we think of as a modern malaise. So, I mean, good examples of basic things that show what I mean by the ancestors were always trying to pass down their rules for living are things like we think of as old folks' wisdom. Things like everything in moderation. We should do everything in moderation, don't take anything to extremes. Or you can't take it with you, about material life and money and so on. And of course, the importance of the group over the individual. All of those kind of things we know from our grandparents or great-grandparents and our generations before, that we might look upon it as quaint, but actually in some ways contain the essence of the knowledge of the entire human species passed on. Even that simple principle, everything in moderation. If we spent our lives thinking about that, working with that, living with that, being that, even that one thing alone, I think we would radically change our experience. So let's see where we can draw some of those types of things that help us experience that. For me, really the starting point for ancient knowledge is astrology. So I'll add that as the third ancient wisdom, and really the first ancient wisdom that I'm going to refer to today, because astrology might be a mathematical system, a divinatory system, a model of the soul. It is so many of those things, but it is also a container of ancient wisdom. Astrology developed and evolved literally over thousands of years, and before it finally formed into a system, and even in forming into a system, it encapsulated and systematized a lot of ancient knowledge. One of the most important things about astrology is that it deals with time. So itself says, here is all of time. Here is all of time condensed into the human experience. So what we learn from astrology is that all of our experience is cyclical, that everything that we experience, we will experience again, that what other people experience, we will ourselves experience, that our experiences come around and around again in our lives, and that means that we get an opportunity to do them better every time. Even understanding the ancient wisdom of 7 years of this followed by 7 years of that is the understanding of astrological cycles. When our ancestors told us that there's 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of drought, they weren't being superstitious, and they weren't talking about arbitrary numbers. They were passing on their experience. And of course, when we study astrology, we discover exactly why we go through 7 years of this followed by 7 years of that. We've got ways to measure what are those 7 years and when are those 7 years. Astrology is not the only wisdom that unfortunately can fall away. It's just the knowledge of the cycles that is so important, whether we get that from an astrologer or a grandparent or whatever. Once we understand that we are part of a cyclical system, and therefore part of a natural system, we can learn to understand our own cycles and benefit from the wisdom of the past. Astrology also really boils down to the idea that we must live according to our own nature, not according to the diktat of the world around us or the people around us or whatever. The astrological chart basically says you are a unique combination of shared human knowledge, experience, bits and pieces, to call them that. And all you can do is be that to the fullest you possibly can, because astrology does not really postulate the idea that you can fundamentally change yourself. But it certainly does postulate the idea that you can master yourself. And mastery is what changes everything, without having to change yourself in the process. I mean, after all, how the hell do you do that? From the Vedic culture, we also have the most clearly outlined fundamental guide to life, which eventually does, of course, through history, become a religious guide in that culture and becomes part of the Hindu religion as well. But when we get to the core principles of the knowledge really of how to live, we can see that they are a universally applicable collection of ancient knowledge that, of course, whoever wrote the Vedas were writing what they already knew or writing what was passed down from their ancestors. And so these most ancient of texts reveal to us some core human ideas that work for all of us today. So the so-called Eightfold Path, which is at the basis of the philosophy of yoga, can be very well used to understand principles of living, even if you're not a student of yoga per se. So let's look at what the 8 principles that the Indian ancestors passed down for us. The first one is self-restraint. Live with self-restraint. That includes the idea of living with moderation and not harming anything or anyone. The idea of vegetarianism comes there, and essentially behaving as you would expect other people to treat you. So treating others as you treat yourself. So that basic idea of doing everything about restraining yourself and being aware of everything around you and not causing harm around you. Principle number 1. If everyone learned how to not cause harm, just principle number 1, we'd have such a vastly different world. It wouldn't even bear the rest of this discussion. The second thing is practicing of personal ethics. That really means disciplining yourself, having a good value system, a spiritual value system, having a spiritual practice of some kind, be it meditation, be it your religious life, be it your service to the world or what you do for your community, or whatever it is for you that is your spiritual discipline that helps you develop a spiritual value system, because that's really what it's all about. Spiritual value system would lead to self-discipline, would lead to personal ethics. The third thing, which doesn't sound something that we would think of as ancient spiritual advice, maintenance of a healthy body. In the system of yoga, they talk about posture, and that's also why they concentrate so much on that. And indeed, posture is certainly one of the ways to do that, and one of the important things to do that. In the classical idea, posture is maintained so that energy can flow up and down the spine correctly and throughout the body. So that principle remains true, but it extends into the idea of mastery of the body, and maintenance of the body is an aspect of self-discipline, it's an aspect of personal ethic, it's an aspect of self-restraint, and allows us actually to much more directly access that knowledge through our bodies that allows us to live better as human beings. Fourthly is breath. And again, it sounds like, why would we talk about those physical things? But certainly one of the great wisdoms of the ancients is that breathing seems to control everything. We can completely control anxiety by breath. People take medications, they go for therapy, they read extensive self-help books. It's a huge issue in our lives, dealing with things like anxiety and stress and so on. But the ancient wisdom has always been that breathing can change your mental state, your emotional state, and your physical state very powerfully. But the bottom line is learning how to breathe correctly and control your breath brings you back to that state of center and moderation and begins to liberate you from the confines of the physical body human being. Learning detachment, letting go of desire. So much of our pain and grief comes from attachment to the outcomes of things. And watch the episode on suffering. We've got a lot more information about that there. So learning how to detach ourselves from the outcomes of what we expect things to be, or from the things that are so important and precious to us, or that we believe define us. Learning detachment. Sixthly, learning concentration. It's another one that we've got a show coming up on. Sounds concentration, isn't that something we do at school? Concentration teaches you how to focus on one thing at a time. Human beings are not capable of multitasking. We fake it very well. People love to say, I multitask. We don't actually multitask. We switch rapidly between different tasks, fragmenting our focus, fragmenting the results, and dramatically increasing stress. So much of our stress today comes from so-called multitasking. Ancient wisdom says, learn how to do one thing at a time. It's way more difficult than it sounds. So there's an art to concentration, but the art of concentration has got the remarkable effect also of reducing or removing anxiety completely and allowing us to achieve more without actually focusing on the outcome, but instead focusing on the task at hand. Another hidden bit of wisdom in there. Meditation is the seventh principle that these ancient masters pass on to us and say is in fact the way that we learn to liberate ourselves from the body and liberate ourselves from time and space. So it's a specific form of a spiritual practice that also helps us discover our humanity beyond the body and beyond material experience. And finally, what that all results in is the bliss of the union with everything, with the divine, the release from the material. An end destination, we're not oriented towards the outcome, but that is the final results of it all. So some powerful things that you can see in that wisdom, that if we could just learn to stick to one or two of them, we will fundamentally change our lives and remove a lot of the suffering that we experience. Makes it very worthwhile, makes it cheaper and easier than therapy and medications. But there's more. And the other side I want to look at is to see what does African wisdom say about this, because African wisdom is something that's also a very ancient system of knowledge that is passed on in order to maintain the best possible harmony in a community and society. The knowledge of the ancestors. We tend to think of African wisdom as naive because it's not written down, or it isn't based on philosophy, it's based instead on pragmaticism. In fact, that's just a different way of measuring something. It's certainly not naive, and just because it's not a written philosophy doesn't make it any lesser than one that is. But what is evident in African culture, which you see very little of in other culture, is the respect for and maintenance of ideas from the past and traditions. I'm not saying that tradition is by default good, that ancient people automatically did things better than we did, and that they knew more than us. All I'm saying, like all of us, we are the same human beings. We're full of superstition and nonsense and violence just like they were. But they also had a guide to living that we seem to have forgotten. And in African culture, we call that Ubuntu, a basically lost guide to living. You don't really see very much in Africa any more than you see anywhere else, and it's much more about the past. You know, a little point I'd like to make about African wisdom, ancestors, and the past. It's the same acknowledgement. When we talk about Vedic culture, we talk about reincarnation and karma and how the past bears down on the present in that way. When we look at Western culture, it's the same. When we look at our bodies, when we look at our psyches, we explain it through genes and we explain it through the experience of childhood. Both of which are talk about genetics and childhood. How does the past bear down on the present? And so African culture is no different, and it calls it ancestors, which boils down to how does the past bear down on the present. And the fundamental thing, as I keep on saying, about how the past does bear down on the present is that it offers us the wisdom to liberate ourselves from the pain of the present. So what is this lost idea called Ubuntu? Well, as I said, African culture is not one that philosophizes too extensively the way that Western culture does, but contemporary African scholars have looked at it and explained it in ways that help us understand some basic principles that refer to what Ubuntu is all about. The basic idea is that there are 7 meanings to what is referred to by this idea Ubuntu. The first one is the respect for and perpetuation of the values of the ancestors. That's the first meaning of Ubuntu, and that's what I've been talking about the whole time. The second thing is living in harmony with everyone and everything around you. That includes all of nature and the environment, understanding a harmonious relationship. You know, many years ago, one of my teachers was the great South African Sangoma Credo Mutwa. And I said to him, if that's true, then why is everyone littering around here? And he said, you know, African people always respected the environment because they lived off the environment. And it's because they found spirit in the environment as well. But as he said, then the European people came along and they taught the African people that no, spirit isn't here everywhere. God lives in an office up in the sky. And so while God is up in the sky, the people around here can do exactly that as they please. And that's why they were littering. That was Credo Mutwa's explanation. And it certainly ties into the loss of the idea of living in harmony with everything around you, a malaise of our time. Similar to do no harm in the Vedic principles. Thirdly, your choices bring responsibilities, i.e. you are responsible for the things you do. Very basic truth, but one that a lot of people could do to know. And fourthly, something very fundamental, everything is one thing. Everything is an expression of the same spirit, and therefore, number 5, we must all work together in order to achieve any kind of harmony in the world. Because we're all the same thing, it only makes sense that we should all be working together towards things and not competing or fighting. And so that leads to the 6th principle, which is cooperation. Cooperation, which means where people's goals differ, they should compromise and cooperate so that we all work towards the same thing. A very fundamental difference between ancient thinking and modern thinking. We see ourselves very much as an individual. It's led to every man for himself, and it's led to the glorification of the self and of the ego and of the personal identity, and contributes to a loss of a lot of this wisdom and a loss of our relationship with other people, with the rest of nature, and with spirit itself. You know, these ideas of working together, everything is one thing, cooperation, are expressed in the phrase umtu ngumtu ngabantu, which really means a person is a person only by virtue of how they treat other people. So it is through each other that we discover our humanity. That is what that refers to, and that refers to those principles of all is one and cooperation is the order of the day. Finally, faith is the final principle of Ubuntu. The innate understanding that everything is spirit, that everything comes from spirit, everything has its purpose in spirit. So if we collaborate and cooperate, we will discover ourselves to be that. We will discover the expression of that purpose. The essence of all ancestral wisdom is the same. We are all in it together. We're not separate from each other. We're not separate from the world. We must get on with trying to be the best human beings that we can, not focusing on outcomes and rewards, focusing instead on our collective humanity and our unique human soul, whatever exactly that is, whether it's a personal thing or whether it's something unimaginably greater, what makes us human. We must seek spirit. That ultimately allows us to lift ourselves out of material limitations and realize ourselves. Realize that we are one and we are all of the same spirit. Be we human, be we nature, be we anything else in nature. That is the essence of all ancestral wisdom. Some ancient wisdom still relevant today. Astrology, of course. Buy the book before Christmas. Best Christmas present you could give, because it lasts the whole of next year. And I will be back next week to talk about some post-mortem of the ANC elective conference and the last month ahead for the year. Join me next Friday.